Councillor Colley, if you could just give us just a bit of an update on some of the main areas and the highlights of your Cabinet Member portfolio first, anything you'd like to highlight with the committee, and then we'll go straight into questions.
Sure. So it's getting on for a year since I was last here. We had budget scrutiny in January. I think that's probably the last time I was here at this committee. So if I give you a bit of a flavour of what I've been working on over those months. So starting with the finance side of my portfolio, unsurprisingly, the principal piece of work has been for myself and for the Strategic Director of Finance and Governance, Duncan Whitfield, looking at budget in delivering against very difficult cutbacks that we've been facing as an authority, and I think you've been having updates here over Scrutiny about the work of the Budget Recovery Board, as has the Audit and Governance Committee, particularly looking at the great pressures on our budgets from adults and children's services. We've also, of course, been doing a lot of work looking forward into next year's budget when we face similar very significant challenges, and I won't go into that because we've got a whole session on the budget coming up in January. Also on the finance side, we've been doing a lot of work on universal credit. Southwark is sadly one of the first parts of the country to see the universal credit rollout, and one of the things we decided to do, given that we had both that early rollout and the fact that we are a very significant social landlord, was that we felt we had an opportunity and a responsibility to make sure that we were really tracking the impact of universal credit on our tenants and on our rent accounts. And so we commissioned a joint piece of work with Croydon Council, that's also an early rollout area, and Peabody Trust to track that impact. So John Smith Institute did that piece of research for us, and we also had Britain Thinks do some focus work with some tenants who had gone over to universal credit to see what the human impact was being on people's lives. And really it was fairly unsurprising news that people were very rapidly falling into rent arrears due to the design of universal credit, meaning that people were going without benefits for at least 6 weeks, and in many cases a great deal longer than that, and that they were struggling to get back out of debt over even an extended period of time. The Smith Institute tracked people's rent accounts over 5 to 6 months to see how people were doing as their universal credit did come through. So we've done a great deal of work around that piece of work to launch that at the House of Lords with the help of Lord Kerslake, the chair of Peabody Trust, and to do a lot of promotional work on that. And most recently we had a stakeholder conference with representatives of lots of other boroughs and housing associations coming along to try and learn from that. And we were really pleased to see when the Chancellor delivered his budget that he started to make some of the changes that we had asked for universal credit, particularly to reduce the waiting time, which we'd hoped for, although it's still a long wait for universal credit. We're seeing some forms of temporary accommodation coming out of universal credit, which is really important to us in terms of being able to collect rent for people in temporary accommodation. And then we're particularly pleased to see the announcement that housing benefit would continue for people for 2 weeks after they've made their universal credit claim, whereas previously they've been completely cut off with nothing the moment they made their universal credit claim. And that was one of our specific recommendations that we've been making for some months. So we were really pleased to see that. I don't think that's the end of the story. I think we're going to have to keep on doing a lot of work on universal credit to try and make sure that the worst impacts are ameliorated and that they improve things. I think there are a lot of things that the government, and particularly DWP, could be doing to improve the system if they work more closely with local authorities and other social landlords. I think they've been quite dogmatic about the way that they process claims, which is resulting in claims taking longer to process than they need to. So that's a continuing piece of work for us. We have, on the pension fund, particularly been working on the implementation of our new investment strategy around carbon reduction and divestment from fossil fuels, and we should hopefully be in a place in the next couple of weeks to start moving some money into some low carbon funds. And then coming away from the finance department, and into the Housing Modernisation department. Digital infrastructure has been a big part of my work this year. We've agreed our digital infrastructure strategy at Cabinet last month, and particularly focused on the rollout of fast broadband, super fast broadband in Rotherhithe. We have gone live on our shared service for ICT with Brent and Lewisham at the beginning of November, and we've been improving the channel shift and the website for customer services. And since I last came to see you, I have joined the London Council's Capital Ambitions Board, which is our regional improvement body, and that has been really exciting work that's going on there, looking at the opportunities for digital technology in particular to modernise public services, and real opportunities there which I think are tremendously exciting, and where we're going to be doing a pilot project soon looking at the potential applications for predictive analytics to identify people who are at risk of homelessness for early intervention work, which I think could be really exciting.
Yeah.
So looking forward to that. No recourse to public funds has been an ongoing issue in terms of that budget recovery. That's been one of the overspend areas that sits within my own portfolio, and we've had some good work this year with real great work with the Home Office to try and make sure people's immigration cases are resolved so that people can come out of that no recourse form of support and move on to more regular benefits and indeed get into employment.
Yeah.
And then I have a new portfolio responsibility since we were here last year, partly why Deborah is here, which is traded services. So this is something that came out of the joint partnership panel between ourselves and our unions, and particularly UCAT and Unite, who have for some time been very keen that we bring housing repairs that in the south of the borough in-house. We have an in-house housing repairs service in the north. And so what we decided to do was we've traditionally had SBS that sits in traded services, sitting with the housing lead, with pest control and asset management sitting with various environment members, but nobody who's really taking responsibility for that commercialisation, that going out there and getting more business for traded services. So we decided to move those over to my own portfolio, and so that we could have a bit of a separation between Steph's responsibility to tenants and housing management from a housing client side, whilst I would be more of the champion for SBS. And the result of that is a decision we'll be looking at tomorrow, which will be an in-principle decision to bring housing repairs in-house, albeit that we've got to come back in March with a real strong implementation plan to make sure that SBS are ready and able to deliver those housing repairs in-house for the entire borough. So that's been a new piece of work.
Good. Okay. Thank you. That's very useful. I've got a few questions that I want to kick off with, but if members of the committee want to indicate to me, and I will come to you in due course. I want to start off with the IT shared service. That went live 1st of November, going in the in-house service with Brent and Lewisham. What's your general view on how that went, that transfer to the new system, and can you give us a progress report on how things are going?
Sure. So I think surprisingly smoothly.
Right.
I mean, we were quite concerned in the run, but you always are with a big changeover like that. And we knew from Lewisham that they'd had a few challenges as they went through that handover. But things went much, much better here in Southwark, in part because of the experience that the shared service had with Lewisham, who had also come from Capita into the shared service about a year previously. But also because the relationship with Capita was much better. So our experience has been that Capita were very welcoming of the shared service team coming in and getting involved in advance. And some of the things that that Lewisham had experienced in terms of new kit having to go in day one was not the case here in Southwark. So we didn't have to have all new kit and things like that. So it was really about our teams taking over the sort of support services straight away. And I think it went pretty well, all things considered. I mean, there are some things, I know that the team did a lot of work in advance. I think they came along to this committee to brief members. as well as doing drop-ins and sessions all across the authority in all of our offices and sites to make sure that everybody was prepared, that people were not getting overexcited. It's obviously not an immediate day one transformation, it was never going to be, but it was about it going smoothly. I think what I had hoped for was that people wouldn't really particularly notice that it changed, and I think that's pretty much how it went. We have had a few issues with moving over to the online support service, mostly for people getting used to it, but I think that's now going much better. There was a bit of an issue with tickets not transferring over from the old system to the new. That's come through, and now the numbers on the system are being driven down.
But is the most significant change here that now, as cabinet member, when things go wrong, you have that kind of direct control with your senior management team to put things right, but also in the longer term, in terms of what our IT offer is to staff and to others as well, that when we come up with strategies in order to improve that, actually you can directly do something about it rather than us being locked into kind of longer term contracts with a private company who will insist on extra money every time we ask for something of that sort.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we'd had a development freeze for a good few months ahead of the changeover because we didn't want to be coping with anything other than the changeover. So I think there's a real opportunity now to move things forward. A lot of that, though, is making sure we're on a strong platform to move forward from. So one of the big projects still outstanding on that changeover is moving over from the Capita servers, which we're still sitting on, for at least another few months. We're extended. I mean, it's up for a year, but we could go sooner than that, we hope, and over to the shared service data centres. And that's actually going to be a big changeover and probably a bigger risk point than it was in November. So I don't want to get...
Okay, we need to look out for that.
We're not out of the woods on that handover yet. But yes, I agree. There's a real opportunity to move forward in a more flexible way, to not have to go to one big service provider for every request for change that we want to see. So we'll do some of the development in-house, and when we want to do something that we don't want to do in-house, we'll have the opportunity to go out and choose the best contractor for the job without having to go into lengthy negotiations with a single service provider to decide whether or not they want to do it and how much they might charge us. So yeah, I think there's a real opportunity going forward.
So leading on from that, you mentioned SBS and the housing repairs coming in-house, and traded services is now part of your portfolio.
Yes.
Take us forward a couple of years, elections notwithstanding, obviously, and your cabinet member still with responsibility for that area. What's the vision for the housing repairs, for example, in terms of income generation for this borough? How can we use that service in order to bring more money into the council?
Well, the first and most important thing to say is that we will have an excellent repair service that delivers for our council tenants, quite beyond any potential for income generation. And I want us to be in a place where our residents can book their repairs simply and easily online, that they can book an appointment, so they're not sort of waiting for a call back to find out when their repair is going to be and that they've got to fit around us. I want us to be able to provide that excellence of service that people would want, whatever tenure they were living in. Looking forward from having our own services in-house, we'll be in a place where we can break even to start with, because we're not at the moment, because there's not enough work coming SBS's way to cover those fixed costs. We'll be in our new super depot. Maybe 3 years is optimistic. I'm looking at Deborah. No, we'll be in our super depot, which means we'll be able to be much more efficient with all of our traded services in a single site and able to manage their stock in a much more efficient way. Staff will be able to work in a much more mobile way. I spent a day out with one of our plumbers. He has to fill in triplicate form for new stock. That's not what we want to be having our operatives doing in the future. They need to be properly able to fill in what they've used and have their stock ready for collection when they pop back to the depot for as little time as possible. And we'll be starting to provide services, I believe, to other housing landlords, whether in our borough or in neighbouring boroughs. Which is, I think, the real opportunity for us going forward.
Okay, well, last one for me for now, and then I'm going to come to other members of the committee. So I've got Rosie indicating at the moment. So, a general question, but I like to use part of this session as a bit of prep for the much longer budget scrutiny that we're going to have at the end of January, early February. And obviously we'll have lots more detail at that point in terms of the budget paper, budget papers. But could you give us an idea of what the budget situation is looking like at the moment? What are the major challenges as you see them, and what are the major opportunities as well for the way that we're going to be setting the budget this year?
I mean, what we have looking into next year is some very big pressures. We've got funding cuts again from government, to the tune of about £12 million. We have cost pressures in terms of inflation and local government pay. We're factoring in about £7.5 million for inflation and pay at the moment, which may not be enough, depending on how the negotiations go on that front. And then the big pressure is around service costs. What I mentioned earlier around particularly adults and children's, about those growing cost pressures in those areas. And not just children's social care, but also education, as government grant is completely removed for our central services that we provide as a local authority, for things like school improvements, for children with special educational needs, services that we believe we need to continue with, but which we no longer will receive any grant to provide. Now, to some extent, schools pay for those services for us to provide them, but they're under extreme budget pressures too. So this is all stacking up. So that's where we are. On the more positive side, we do have a good agreement with the CCG about Improved Better Care Fund, which will help us out particularly on the adult side. That pretty much covers the pressures in adults at the moment, alongside the budget recovery work. But children's services, we will be increasing their budget very significantly because with all the budget recovery work, one thing that is clear is that we cannot deliver safe children's services without increasing their budget, and so that's what we're proposing to do. But we've got good growth as ever on the council tax base and business rates as well, so that's very positive. But nonetheless, before finding any savings, we've had a £24 million budget gap. We have now published £18 million of savings. It's in the budget report that goes to Cabinet tomorrow. That still leaves us with £5.6 million to find. We'll have a further budget report in January, which will be the one that comes to this committee for consideration. I don't know if Duncan wants to add something about interest rate pooling, which is the other big unknown coming forward.
Welcome. The details of business rate devolution, business rate retention, which is a growth, not a business rate per se. It's a pilot. It starts in 1819. Cash doesn't come out of the system for us until 1920, and we're currently estimating something like £6 million. But compare that, I have to say, with it's a distribution pool. So our retention goes into a pot together with those that growth generated by the City of London, by K&C, by Westminster, and we are slightly unique in as much as we're a top-up authority rather than a tariff authority. So we are growing while we still receive government funding, and as that distribution pool takes place, we actually lose some of our distribution, some of our resources, to the rest of London, which is rather frustrating. But it's a benefit nonetheless. But we must remember it is a pool, it is a pilot. It's a pilot for at least 1 year, but as the memorandum of understanding kicks in with government, it could be for 2 years. But it's one-off, and it's not to fund what we already do. It's meant to fund new things. There is an issue with government about whether public health funding in year 2, that would be year 1920, would pull back on the local authority and local authority resources rather than a specific grant. So there are some major risks involved with the pooling initiative. However, you shouldn't look at a gift horse in the mouth, and it will be more cash for us, which will land into our bank. But we are signing up to the proposal. It's in the Cabinet recommendations tomorrow. That's together with 32 other London boroughs. But I think there's much to be aware of, conscious of as we move forward. For example, if our additional resources are simply compensated by reductions in other parts of the funding system, like public health, even though the system is meant to be without detriment to any of the 33 authorities. So it's complicated, but on the face of it, it's more money for London.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to come to Rosie.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about, you said on universal credit that you felt like there were a few kind of key changes that government could make, particularly in kind of how they're interacting with local authorities over the rollout of UC, that you thought might, could potentially significantly improve the impact that it's having on people. And I just wondered if you could expand a bit on what exactly you see those changes being. And then secondly, whether or not you've had any luck or made any attempt, perhaps in conjunction with other local authorities, to communicate your views on that to central government, and whether you've had any, what the reception's been, if that is the case, if so.
Sure. So our principal recommendations, we did have an opportunity, particularly through giving evidence at the Work and Pensions Select Committee, to put our views in through the committee, and the committee then passed those on, as well as us regularly writing to ministers with mixed responses. So we have had some good success there in terms of, particularly temporary accommodation is due to come out in April. That, though, it's not entirely clear which forms of temporary accommodation. Will it just be emergency temporary accommodation? We believe it should be all forms of temporary accommodation. We've got to the rather silly situation now where our teams particularly attempt to place people in temporary accommodation in boroughs where they don't have universal credit yet, because they can then go on housing benefit, and we can collect the housing benefit element of the rent, because we pay any amount of a cost of rent above what people can get in housing benefit. If they go into universal credit, they typically do not get any universal credit in a timely basis while people are in temporary accommodation, and we're picking up all the cost. We're looking at a budget, particularly possibly having to write off £500,000 in the general fund, just due to not being able to collect rent for universal credit, which is a huge cost, and it's getting worse. So that's helped. I would like to see, though, perhaps government reimbursing us for that cost. I think they are recognising they've made a mistake there. We had been writing to them about it for about 2 years. So I'd quite like a cheque, please. Bank transfer would be fine, if we're going to be more digital. So that's good news, but I think they could go further. The time people have to wait, I think, is still too long. They've reduced that wait time by about a week. But really, that still leaves people 5 weeks with no money, which is really impossible. The thing that our research really spelt out was that the people who are moving on to universal credit are people who typically already have rent arrears and debt. They're not families who can just have money in the bank to be able to get by on for 5 weeks. The focus groups found that people were desperate not to end up in debt, were doing their very best to borrow from friends and family. They didn't want to take an advance from DWP because they knew that they would have to pay that back, and they were finding that situation of having no income at all absolutely devastating, and causing a massive amount of stress and anxiety to people. So I still think that length of time to wait is too long, and the housing benefit roll-on is helpful. In terms of further improvements, we think that at the moment the government's really trying to do 2 things at once with universal credit. There's that whole bringing all the different benefits together. It's supposed to be simpler. Perhaps it will be for some people. But at the same time, they're also trying to make a sort of, I suppose, a nudge to make people take more responsibility for paying their own rent. So instead of people having their housing benefit paid direct to their social landlord, they've got to receive the money and pay it. there's not much evidence that people claiming benefits particularly want to do that. But perhaps in the long term it's desirable. But in the short term, we've recommended to government really get your system working, because you're taking a very long time to process your claims, and maybe allow a bit more help for people. So a good example is that on verifying people's claims, when they say how much rent they pay, if they don't match to a penny with what the government then, DWP then asks us to say the rent is, then it's back to that individual to match it up. And, you know, I mean, come on. I mean, if you're coming through Southwark Council to say this person's made a universal credit claim, how much is the rent? If we say this is how much the rent is, that's how much the rent is. In fact, we could just give them all the information. We've already told them all of our properties to speed things up. We could tell them all the rent levels if that would speed things up. But they don't want the information from us. They want the resident, the tenant, to take responsibility and to provide the information themselves, matching it to the penny, or they won't give them any payment for their rent costs. I think that's just dogmatic and silly. It's the reason why it's taking so long for people to get their housing costs paid and why they're getting into rent arrears for such a long time. So I think they could just ease up on some of that stuff, get their system working, and if they want to go back and put more responsibility on the individual in the future, well, that's up to them. But I think they could be more pragmatic, share more information with us about what the status is of people's claims, what do they call it, the implicit consent, isn't it? So at the moment, our rent officers would be able to find out from our housing benefit officers where somebody's housing benefit claim was at and make sure we weren't taking any ridiculous action against people for rent arrears. But now with universal credit, we'll have been told that somebody has made a claim, but we won't know what stage their claim is at or whether they are in payment as yet. So it's very hard for us to know what's going on, and they won't give us any information unless we have the tenant sitting next to us on the end of the phone explicitly giving their consent to give information. So I think that's another area where we could make the system work more smoothly if they were a bit less dogmatic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Kieran.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions before. I just want to come back to something you said, Duncan. You mentioned the public health budget. I didn't quite catch what you were saying. Were you saying that the money that we receive currently that is designated public health may disappear in the future and that we may have to fall back on